Lady Margaret Beaufort stands as one of the most influential yet often overlooked figures in English history. As the mother of Henry VII and grandmother to Henry VIII, she was the linchpin of the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that would shape the course of England for over a century. Born into the turbulent period of the Wars of the Roses, Margaret's life was marked by remarkable resilience, political maneuvering, and an unwavering commitment to securing her son's future. Yet, despite her central role in the establishment of the Tudor monarchy, her legacy has often been overshadowed by the more flamboyant figures of her time. Over the years, historians have re-examined her life, revealing a woman of immense intelligence, political acumen, and faith. From her early years to her strategic marriages and her influence at court, Margaret's story has evolved, reflecting changing views on female power, agency, and influence in a male-dominated world. The grand narrative of English history. Few figures stand as both the architect and guardian of a dynasty quite like Lady Margaret Beaufort. Revered in modern scholarship as the mother of the Tudor dynasty, she was more than just the mother of Henry VII. She was a political strategist, a devout patron of learning and religion, and a woman of remarkable resilience and intelligence in an age that offered little formal power to women. Her life unfolded against the chaotic backdrop of 15th-century England, a time marked by civil war, factional rivalry, and the collapse of royal authority. In this volatile landscape, Margaret Beaufort would secure her son's ascent to the throne and, in doing so, help shape the future of the English monarchy. To understand Margaret's pivotal role, one must first understand the period in which she lived. The 15th century in England was a time of unparalleled turbulence. The 100 Years' War with France was drawing to a close, leaving a generation of disaffected nobles and soldiers. At home, the country was gripped by the dynastic conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, a protracted and bloody struggle between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. These wars would rage across the second half of the century, toppling kings, decimating noble families, and leaving a trail of instability in their wake. Amidst this political and social chaos, Margaret Beaufort was born, not just a passive witness to history, but a decisive participant in its making. She was born in 1443 at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, the only child of Margaret Beauchamp and John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Her paternal lineage traced back to John of Gaunt, the third son of King Edward III, and his mistress, later wife Catherine Swynford. This connection placed Margaret among the highest ranks of the English nobility, though the Beauforts' legitimacy had long been a subject of controversy. When Richard II legitimized the Beaufort line, he had done so with the stipulation that they would be barred from inheriting the throne. Nevertheless, in the eyes of many, Margaret had royal blood flowing through her veins, a fact that would become politically explosive in years to come. Her father, John Beaufort, was a military commander with a checkered reputation, having suffered a humiliating defeat in France during the later stages of the 100 Years' War. He returned to England in disgrace and died shortly after Margaret's birth, either by illness or, as some suspect, suicide. His death marked the beginning of Margaret's complex relationship with the turbulent world of noble guardianship and courtly politics. Still a baby, she became an heiress of immense wealth, and with that came intense political interest. Control over Margaret, and crucially her hand in marriage, meant access to the vast Beaufort inheritance and a potential stake in the royal succession. The matter of her guardianship became a pressing concern for the crown. King Henry VI, a weak and increasingly unstable monarch, took personal responsibility for Margaret's welfare, likely recognizing the political importance of keeping her within royal influence. She was placed under the wardship of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, who arranged her betrothal to his son, John de la Pole. Though the marriage was never consummated and was eventually annulled, it marked the beginning of a lifetime in which Margaret's marital status would serve as a political tool for more powerful players. Even as a child, Margaret was a commodity in a game of dynastic chess. The instability of the royal house meant that alliances were everything, and noble families often brokered marriages like treaties, tools to gain favor or secure claims. By the age of 12, Margaret was married again, this time to Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of King Henry VI and a man of Lancastrian loyalty. It was a match that combined royal bloodlines and political ambition, for Edmund was determined to cement the Tudor family's place in the higher nobility. Tragically, the marriage would prove short-lived. Edmund died of the plague in captivity during the Wars of the Roses, leaving a 13-year-old Margaret a pregnant widow in a country descending further into chaos. Margaret gave birth to her only child, Henry Tudor, in January 1457 at Pembroke Castle. The ordeal nearly cost her life. The physical trauma of such a young girl giving birth would leave her unable to conceive again. But the survival of both mother and child would prove one of the most consequential events in English history. From the moment of Henry's birth, Margaret's entire life became dedicated to his safety, his future, and ultimately his ascent to the throne. Her maternal devotion went beyond the private sphere and became a political mission. She maneuvered with extraordinary care, shifting her allegiances as needed to protect her son and position him for power. The political significance of Margaret's lineage cannot be overstated. Though the Beaufort line had been barred from the throne, their descent from Edward III provided a legitimate basis for claim, especially when the ruling house appeared weak or illegitimate. For Margaret, the birth of her son was not just a personal event, but the birth of a potential monarch. Even as a teenager, she seemed to understand the monumental possibilities of her son's future. While she had no personal ambition for the crown, she would dedicate every resource, every alliance, and every calculation to putting her son there. Margaret's early life, then, was marked by a collision of personal tragedy and dynastic destiny. She lost her father at birth, was married off at 12, widowed at 13, and gave birth to the founder of the Tudor dynasty before reaching adulthood. These experiences shaped her into a woman of formidable strength and shrewd judgment. The England she inherited was fractured and dangerous, ruled by fragile monarchs and divided by feuding nobles. But within this world, she carved out a role that transcended the limitations placed on women of her time. She understood how to operate behind the scenes, how to wield influence without a crown, and how to build alliances that would eventually culminate in her son becoming King Henry VII. Margaret Beaufort's legacy is inseparable from the Tudor dynasty she helped create. Her son's victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 marked the end of the Wars of the Roses and the dawn of a new era in English history. But that triumph was not Henry's alone. It was made possible by the sacrifices, schemes, and unyielding determination of his mother. She was a woman who saw the currents of history shifting and, rather than being swept away, chose to steer the course. Her role was not merely maternal but foundational. She laid the groundwork for one of England's most iconic royal families. Without Margaret Beaufort, the Tudor dynasty may never have existed at all. At the heart of the Tudor saga lies a story not only of dynasties and wars, but of a young girl thrust prematurely into the treacherous world of adult responsibilities, noble ambitions, and maternal devotion. Margaret Beaufort's childhood was brutally brief, and the course of her life, indeed the very future of the English crown, was shaped by the decisions made for her during those formative years. Her marriage at the age of 12 and subsequent pregnancy marked the beginning of a life steeped in political maneuvering and personal sacrifice, all of which would culminate in the rise of her only son, Henry Tudor, to the English throne. But this journey began with tragedy, solitude, and extraordinary strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. The marriage of Margaret Beaufort to Edmund Tudor in 1455 was not an anomaly in the landscape of 15th-century noble life. Girls of high birth were often married young, their unions forged not for love or companionship, but for power, land, and dynastic strategy. However, even within this context, Margaret's situation was particularly precarious. At 12 years old, she was barely past childhood, still growing and developing. Yet she was expected to take on the roles of wife, hostess, and soon mother. Edmund Tudor, at 24, was a man of political ambition and Lancastrian loyalty, half-brother to King Henry VI, and determined to cement his family's influence in a period of growing instability. His union with Margaret was a calculated move, designed to bind the Beaufort and Tudor claims together at a time when the Lancastrian cause was under threat. The decision to consummate the marriage so early had devastating consequences. At 13, Margaret became pregnant. For a girl of her age and size, by all accounts petite and physically slight, pregnancy and childbirth posed grave medical risks. In the mid-15th century, maternal mortality was high even for adult women, let alone children. Margaret's pregnancy was not merely a private ordeal, but a politically charged event. The child she carried represented the fusion of two powerful bloodlines, and, perhaps, a future claimant to the throne. But the toll on her body would be immense. As she carried her child to term, the country around her descended deeper into conflict. The Wars of the Roses were taking shape, and loyalty to either the Lancastrian or Yorkist factions became a matter of life and death. While Margaret was in the later stages of her pregnancy, her husband Edmund was captured by Yorkist forces under the Earl of Warwick and imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle. There, amid squalor and disease, Edmund succumbed to the plague or a form of camp fever in November 1456, leaving Margaret a 13-year-old widow. His death was not only a personal blow, but a political complication, casting her and her unborn child into a position of vulnerability and uncertainty. Alone, frightened, and grieving, Margaret delivered her only child on the 28th of January, 1457, at Pembroke Castle in Wales. The birth was reportedly long and difficult, and though she survived, it left lasting damage to her health. She would never bear another child. For the rest of her life, she carried the physical scars of that traumatic experience. Yet despite the hardship, her newborn son, Henry Tudor, would become the hope around which she built her life's purpose. The moment of his birth marked the beginning of a lifelong mission, ensuring his survival, protecting his claim, and ultimately guiding him to the throne of England. The implications of her widowhood and single motherhood were immense. In a society where a woman's legal and financial standing was tethered to her husband, Margaret found herself in an extremely delicate position. She was still legally a minor, and her lands and titles were therefore subject to royal control. Though she was a mother, she had virtually no legal authority over her child. Custody of young Henry passed into the hands of his uncle Jasper Tudor, who became his guardian and protector. Margaret, though fiercely devoted to her son, was forced to live apart from him and rely on the good graces of others to ensure his well-being. Her grief, however, did not paralyze her. On the contrary, it forged in her a deep resilience and sense of purpose. Margaret understood that her son's future depended not only on military strength or royal favor, but on calculated political engagement. Even at such a young age, she began cultivating the skills and alliances that would serve her and her son in the years to come. She remained close to Jasper Tudor, whose loyalty to the Lancastrian cause never wavered. Over time, she would marry twice more, first to Henry Stafford and then to Thomas Stanley, but neither union ever displaced her role as Henry's primary champion and protector. The emotional impact of her early motherhood cannot be overstated. Margaret was, by all definitions, a child herself when she gave birth. The physical suffering she endured left her unable to have more children, and some accounts suggest she walked with a slight stoop in later life, a reminder of the damage done to her young body. Yet she did not retreat into bitterness or despair. Instead, her early experience of loss and duty shaped a woman of extraordinary resolve. The personal tragedy of losing her husband, the loneliness of enforced separation from her child, and the knowledge that her own body had paid the price of dynastic ambition. All these became part of the armor she would wear as she navigated the treacherous politics of late medieval England. In medieval society, young widows like Margaret were expected to remarry quickly, often to men chosen by political necessity rather than personal preference. Her second marriage, to Henry Stafford, was more stable and afforded her some respite from the political storms that had dominated her early life. Yet she never allowed her new role to distract her from the importance of her son's position. As Henry grew older, his own status as a Lancastrian heir grew more dangerous. The Yorkists now held the throne under Edward IV, and any potential rival, especially one of royal blood, was considered a threat. Margaret's ability to navigate this world of hidden allegiances and shifting power plays began to take shape in these years. Though she had little direct control over events, she positioned herself as a trusted figure in courtly circles, careful never to overreach or attract suspicion. Yet beneath this surface diplomacy lay a quiet and unwavering mission. One day, her son would return and he would wear the crown. What makes Margaret Beaufort's story all the more remarkable is how much she achieved from behind the scenes. Unlike queens or princesses who wielded ceremonial authority, Margaret's power was largely informal and deeply personal. She cultivated networks of support, maintained correspondence with key political players, and used her wealth and influence strategically. These qualities began to manifest even during the most difficult years of her life, when she was still just a teenager raising a child from afar. Her marriage to Edmund Tudor had lasted only a brief moment in her long life, but it defined the path she would walk forever after. She would always be the mother of Henry Tudor, and she would live for that role with singular devotion. In retrospect, the tragedy of Margaret's early motherhood becomes not only a story of personal suffering, but a turning point in English history. Had she not survived that birth, the Tudor dynasty might never have emerged. Had she not fought so fiercely to protect her son in the decades that followed, the Battle of Bosworth may never have been won. And had she not possessed the intelligence, patience, and political acumen to play the long game, Henry VII might never have reached the throne. Her personal loss, then, becomes a cornerstone of national transformation. Margaret Beaufort's early years read more like the script of a tragic play than a biography. Married off before adolescence, widowed before maturity, and a mother before she could fully comprehend what it meant to be a wife, she endured the worst that her era had to offer. And yet, she emerged from those trials with a fierce sense of purpose that never wavered. Her story is not just about suffering but about agency, about how a young woman, denied power in the traditional sense, carved out a role for herself that would shape the destiny of a kingdom. Through tragedy, she became the architect of triumph. And in the echo of her early motherhood, one can hear the first heartbeat of the Tudor dynasty. The Wars of the Roses were not merely a series of brutal battles for the English throne. They were a test of endurance, loyalty, and cunning. For many noble families, they brought ruin. For others, they created opportunities. But for Margaret Beaufort, the conflict was something more profound. A battlefield not just of swords but of wits, patience, and long-term vision. In an England torn between the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, Margaret emerged not as a combatant in the traditional sense, but as a political survivor. She maneuvered through a landscape littered with betrayal and shifting allegiances, always with a singular purpose: to protect the life and future claim of her son, Henry Tudor. The struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York originated in deep dynastic tensions, stemming from rival claims to the throne. The Lancastrian kings had held power since the deposition of Richard II in 1399, but questions regarding their legitimacy lingered. When Henry VI, a gentle and pious but ineffectual ruler, suffered repeated bouts of mental illness, the kingdom was left vulnerable. Into this void stepped Richard, Duke of York, whose claim to the throne was arguably stronger by blood. The conflict that ensued over decades, the Wars of the Roses, would see kings crowned and deposed, families annihilated, and the fate of the crown teeter on the edge. Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of the Lancastrian line through the Beauforts, was born into this maelstrom. As a young widow and mother to a boy who would one day become the last serious Lancastrian claimant, her life was marked by constant risk. The victory of the Yorkists in the early 1460s, particularly the accession of Edward IV in 1461 after the defeat and murder of Henry VII's heir, Prince Edward, changed everything. The Yorkist regime sought to consolidate power, eliminating threats, especially those with royal blood. Henry Tudor, though just a child, was one such threat. Margaret's challenge was clear: to ensure her son's survival in a realm ruled by men who would prefer him dead. She began this quiet war with a strategic second marriage. In 1464, she married Sir Henry Stafford, a member of the powerful Stafford family, which had Yorkist sympathies and significant influence. Though politically astute, Margaret did not marry for power alone. By most accounts, she found in Stafford a more stable and perhaps even kind partner than she had known before. Importantly, he provided her a degree of safety. With Stafford's moderate loyalty to Edward IV, Margaret could begin to integrate into Yorkist court life without drawing too much suspicion. But even in relative peace, Margaret's heart and mind were preoccupied with her son's safety. After the death of her first husband, the custody of Henry Tudor had passed to his uncle Jasper Tudor. However, when the Yorkists gained control, Jasper fled into exile, and young Henry came under the authority of William Herbert, a staunch Yorkist supporter. Herbert, appointed by Edward IV, was tasked with raising Henry in the Yorkist mold. This move was both a calculated act of control and an attempt at re-education, perhaps to neutralize the boy's Lancastrian sympathies by bringing him up in loyalty to Edward IV. Margaret had little say in this arrangement, and the separation was deeply painful. She visited Henry when allowed, but her influence over his daily life was limited. Still, she never gave up. Behind the scenes, Margaret cultivated relationships that would ensure she remained aware of her son's well-being and any political shifts that might threaten or benefit him. Her correspondence, alliances, and even gestures of deference to the Yorkist regime all carried a single motive: Henry must survive. The 1460s and early 1470s were a time of uncertainty and volatility. Edward IV, though young and popular, faced challenges to his rule from within his own Yorkist camp. The powerful Earl of Warwick, once Edward's greatest ally, turned against him in a shocking reversal. Warwick's discontent stemmed from Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville and the increasing power of her family, which sidelined many nobles who had helped Edward ascend to the throne. Sensing an opportunity, Warwick allied with the exiled Lancastrians, including Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI. For a brief moment in 1470, the political tables turned. Henry VI was restored to the throne in a dramatic reversal known as the Readeption. For Margaret Beaufort, this restoration presented both hope and danger. On one hand, the return of a Lancastrian king could mean a new future for her son, perhaps even a restoration of titles or land. On the other hand, she had carefully positioned herself and her husband within Yorkist circles. A sudden shift in allegiance could be perilous. Margaret's decision during this moment reveals much about her character. She did not act rashly. She did not commit publicly to either side. Instead, she waited. Her husband, Henry Stafford, remained officially loyal to Edward IV, even after the king's brief exile, though there were signs that Stafford also maintained some lines of communication with Warwick's faction. Margaret, as always, balanced on the knife's edge. The Readeption lasted less than a year. Edward IV returned in 1471 and defeated the combined forces of Warwick and the Lancastrians at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. Warwick was killed and Prince Edward, the only son of Henry VI, was slain on the battlefield. Soon after, Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London, likely on Edward's orders. These events marked a turning point. With the deaths of so many Lancastrian claimants, Henry Tudor, now a teenager in exile in Brittany, became the last remaining male with a serious claim from the Lancastrian line. The implications were enormous. Henry's very existence was now a threat to the Yorkist regime. Margaret understood this better than anyone. Her mission took on a renewed urgency. With her husband Henry Stafford having died in 1471, possibly from wounds sustained at the Battle of Barnet, Margaret was once again a widow. Yet she was now also in a more delicate and powerful position than ever. Her son's survival had become not only her personal goal, but also a point of interest for others who had grown disillusioned with Edward IV's rule. Margaret began forging connections among disaffected nobles, many of whom had lost titles, lands, or favor in Edward's increasingly centralized monarchy. She carefully maintained her reputation as a loyal subject, even as she quietly nurtured networks of potential allies. One of her most significant political calculations came in 1472, when she married Thomas Stanley, a politically powerful nobleman who served as Edward IV's Lord High Constable. The marriage was a masterstroke. Stanley was a consummate survivor, known for his ability to shift allegiance with minimal consequence. By aligning herself with Stanley, Margaret gained access to court, protection, and a web of intelligence. During the later years of Edward IV's reign, Margaret remained circumspect in her political actions, but she never lost sight of her goal. She ensured that her son remained in exile but informed. She communicated with Jasper Tudor and other allies abroad, helping to lay the groundwork for a potential return. She walked the line between Yorkist loyalty and Lancastrian ambition with extraordinary finesse. Few could have imagined that this devout, composed noblewoman, often seen at prayer, known for her piety and learning, was also orchestrating the early stages of a rebellion that would one day topple a dynasty. By the time of Edward IV's death in 1483, Margaret had weathered 3 decades of war, loss, and uncertainty. She had seen kings rise and fall, families torn apart, and loyalties discarded. Through it all, she had survived. More than that, she had positioned herself for the next phase of her campaign, bringing her son back to England to claim the crown. But to understand how she succeeded in that ultimate goal, one must recognize the genius of her political survival during the years when the Yorkists ruled supreme. Margaret's brilliance lay not in open rebellion, but in strategic alignment. She never overplayed her hand, never made herself an obvious threat. She chose her words, her marriages, and her movements with care. Her life during Edward IV's reign was a masterclass in silent resistance. Even as she knelt in chapels or moved among courtiers, her mind was always on her son, and the crown that could one day be his. The Wars of the Roses are often remembered for their epic battles, but they were equally won and lost in the chambers of noble houses, the pages of secret letters, and the quiet negotiations of those who could not fight on horseback but knew how to wage a different kind of war. Margaret Beaufort was such a warrior. While others sought power for themselves, she fought for the future of another. While kings wielded swords, she wielded silence and strategy. And in doing so, she kept alive a flame that would one day ignite the Tudor age. In the dangerous game of dynastic politics that defined 15th-century England, Margaret Beaufort played her hand with an unparalleled blend of patience, cunning, and unwavering maternal determination. As the Wars of the Roses waned but tensions still ran high, Margaret's resolve only deepened. Her life had been spent navigating a perilous world ruled by men and defined by bloodlines, yet her singular ambition, to see her son, Henry Tudor, seated on the English throne, gave her a focus that bordered on religious conviction. From the moment she gave birth at 13 to the child who would one day become King Henry VII, Margaret had been quietly laying the groundwork. And after years of calculated silence, she began to act. Following the sudden death of Edward IV in 1483, the political climate shifted dramatically. The throne passed to his 12-year-old son, Edward V, but this brief moment of inheritance quickly gave way to crisis. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's brother, moved swiftly to seize control. He declared the young king and his siblings illegitimate, imprisoned Edward V in the Tower of London, and had himself crowned as King Richard III. This brazen usurpation shocked the realm and stirred unrest. For Margaret Beaufort, it was the opening she had waited for. Richard III's rise to power, marked by suspicion and whispers of murder, fractured the fragile unity within the Yorkist camp. Many nobles who had loyally served Edward IV were appalled by Richard's actions, particularly the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. Amid this climate of mistrust, Margaret began to mobilize. Although outwardly she maintained the appearance of loyalty to Richard III, she was, in truth, preparing a bold and unprecedented rebellion. At the heart of her plan was her son Henry Tudor, who remained in exile in Brittany. With the direct male lines of both the Yorkists and Lancastrians effectively extinguished, Henry's claim, though through a female line and complicated by the Beauforts' earlier illegitimacy, now stood out as legitimate in a land yearning for stability. Margaret understood this. She knew that for Henry to have a real chance at seizing the throne, his appeal needed to extend beyond the remnants of the Lancastrian loyalists. He would need to win the hearts of those disaffected with Richard III, including former Yorkists. To achieve this, Margaret wove a network of alliances, quietly, carefully, and with immense skill. Among her key allies was John Morton, the Bishop of Ely, a seasoned statesman who had once served Edward IV and was deeply skeptical of Richard's rule. Morton, imprisoned by Richard for his political loyalties, maintained secret communication with Margaret even from captivity. His legal expertise and connections within both ecclesiastical and political circles were invaluable. Another powerful ally came from an unlikely source: Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed queen of Edward IV. Having once been Margaret's rival as queen to a Yorkist king, Elizabeth now found herself stripped of influence and confined to sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her daughters. The apparent murder of her two sons, Edward V and Richard, left her not only grief-stricken but politically isolated. Margaret recognized the opportunity to unite their causes. Through trusted intermediaries, she approached Elizabeth with a proposition that would change the course of English history: a marriage alliance between Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. This proposal was revolutionary. A union between Henry, the Lancastrian exile, and Elizabeth, a Yorkist princess, would symbolically unite the warring houses and offer the promise of peace to a realm weary of civil strife. Margaret presented the match not merely as a personal alliance, but as a solution to the kingdom's chaos. Elizabeth Woodville, ever pragmatic and seeking the best future for her daughter, agreed in principle. The pact between the two women, forged in secrecy, set in motion a rebellion unlike any England had seen. Facilitating this secret diplomacy were men like Reginald Bray, Margaret's steward and trusted agent. Bray was more than a servant. He was a strategist, an emissary, and a conduit between Margaret and her far-flung network. He coordinated messages between Margaret and Henry, managed resources, and quietly built support among the nobility and gentry. Bray's involvement ensured that even as Margaret appeared compliant at court, her plans moved forward. Operating from within her husband Thomas Stanley's household added a layer of protection. Stanley, a politically astute nobleman who held the position of Lord High Constable under Richard III, had a reputation for opportunism. He rarely committed himself fully to any side until the outcome was certain. While this may have appeared disloyal or cowardly, Margaret turned this to her advantage. His proximity to the king gave her access to courtly gossip and political developments, while his ambiguity shielded her from suspicion. Throughout 1483 and into 1484, Margaret's plan matured. Henry Tudor, with Jasper Tudor at his side, prepared an invasion. Messages were exchanged, funds were gathered, and promises were made. Nobles sympathetic to the cause, many of whom had lost faith in Richard III, offered quiet support. The rebellion was set for October 1483. But the plan, known as the Buckingham Rebellion, unraveled when Henry's fleet was scattered by storms. Meanwhile, the Duke of Buckingham, once a staunch supporter of Richard III and now its leader, was captured and executed. The failure of the rebellion forced Margaret to retreat into cautious diplomacy, but the seeds of revolution had already been sown. Despite the failure, Margaret was not punished severely. Richard III recognized the danger in alienating the powerful Stanley family and chose to place Margaret under nominal house arrest, in the custody of her husband. But Richard underestimated her resolve and the depth of her networks. Margaret continued to plot from the shadows, undeterred by the rebellion's collapse. The political climate continued to shift. Discontent with Richard's rule grew. His alienation of the Woodvilles, the mysterious fate of the princes, and the ruthless suppression of dissent damaged his legitimacy. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor, now residing in the French court, was building an army composed of exiled Englishmen, mercenaries, and French support. He also made a public vow that upon gaining the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York, thereby healing the rift between Lancaster and York. This betrothal promise was a masterstroke, and it had Margaret's fingerprints all over it. It was she who had envisioned this union and persuaded the key parties. By marrying Elizabeth of York, Henry would offer not only royal blood, but the promise of continuity. The union could create a new dynasty, one that might finally end the decades of war. The concept was simple yet potent. Henry Tudor would become king not just by conquest, but by marriage, uniting two great houses and offering legitimacy that both Lancastrians and Yorkists could accept. Margaret's genius was in understanding that political success would come not from division, but from reconciliation. Her life had been shaped by war, exile, and personal loss, but she never allowed bitterness to dictate her strategy. She worked tirelessly to ensure that Henry's claim was not seen as a threat, but as a promise of peace. Throughout 1484 and 1485, Margaret intensified her efforts. She sent word to Henry that the time to act was drawing near. Richard III, increasingly paranoid, continued to lose allies. Even Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, began to shift his loyalty behind the scenes. Though he remained outwardly loyal to Richard, he avoided confrontation and, when the moment came, would choose his steps with care. By the time Henry Tudor landed in Wales in August 1485, Margaret's long years of planning had finally borne fruit. Her agents had secured support from key nobles. Her alliances had delivered a cause greater than revenge or ambition. It was now a national restoration. The decisive battle would take place at Bosworth Field, and the outcome would determine the future of England. But whether or not Henry would win, one fact was indisputable. It was Margaret Beaufort's vision, persistence, and network of quiet loyalties that had made the invasion possible. She had overcome societal constraints, political suspicion, and personal tragedy to orchestrate a rebellion not for herself, but for her son, and beyond that, for the peace of a nation. Margaret never took up arms, never led troops into battle, and yet her influence reshaped the very fabric of English monarchy. In an age when women were expected to remain on the periphery of power, she had become the architect of dynastic transformation. Her quiet defiance, her strategic marriages, her alliances with former enemies, and her relentless advocacy for her son elevated her from noblewoman to kingmaker. In the months leading up to Henry's return, Margaret's role had shifted from protective mother to political mastermind. She orchestrated one of the most effective and far-reaching conspiracies in English history, one that would end in triumph at Bosworth and usher in the Tudor era. But her story was far from over. As mother to the new king, she would become a guiding force in the early Tudor court. She had not only preserved her son's life, she had positioned him to change the world. And in doing so, she rewrote the legacy of women in power. Margaret Beaufort's journey from child bride to the architect of a dynasty stands as one of the most remarkable sagas of ambition, loyalty, and maternal devotion in English history. While kings fought on battlefields and nobles shifted their allegiances, it was Margaret, composed, calculating, and driven, who quietly shaped the future of England, one alliance at a time. The summer of 1485 would mark the culmination of decades of ambition, planning, and patience for Margaret Beaufort, a woman whose influence had long operated behind closed doors, but was now about to be confirmed on the public stage of English history. Though she would never take up a sword nor ride into battle, her hand had helped guide events toward one of the most pivotal conflicts in England's dynastic story, the Battle of Bosworth Field. Through her son, Henry Tudor, Margaret was on the verge of achieving what once seemed impossible: the foundation of a new royal house born from a long-broken realm. England in the mid-1480s was a kingdom fractured by years of war. The Wars of the Roses had seen the crowns of Lancaster and York pass back and forth, leaving behind a legacy of bloodshed and uncertainty. Richard III, who had seized the throne in 1483 by declaring his nephews illegitimate, faced growing opposition not just from the Lancastrian remnants, but increasingly from disillusioned Yorkists as well. Many questioned the fate of the young princes in the Tower and whispered of Richard's ruthless ambition. It was into this atmosphere of distrust and dissatisfaction that Henry Tudor would emerge, not merely as a claimant, but as a beacon of unity and hope. And at the center of this movement stood his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret's role in the events that led to Bosworth was not a dramatic one in the traditional sense. She was not a soldier or public orator. Her weapon was influence, and she wielded it with precision. She had spent years cultivating a web of relationships: nobles, churchmen, courtiers, and even former enemies, united by one vision: removing Richard III and establishing a stable monarchy. With every letter sent to Henry in exile, every secret council convened under the guise of hospitality, and every risk taken in communicating across the Channel, Margaret's strategy matured. One of her greatest assets was her husband, Thomas Stanley. Though publicly loyal to Richard III, Stanley had his own reasons to tread carefully. He was pragmatic and cautious, traits that made him appear untrustworthy to both sides, yet it was precisely this ambiguity that protected him and Margaret alike. When Richard ordered Margaret under house arrest after the failed Buckingham Rebellion in 1483, he placed her in Stanley's custody, not realizing that the two were quietly supporting Henry's cause. Stanley's political neutrality, or so it seemed, allowed him to remain close to the king while secretly preparing to turn the tide. Meanwhile, Margaret stayed in close communication with her son. Through intermediaries like Reginald Bray and John Morton, key figures in the underground network supporting Henry, she coordinated plans, secured funds, and mapped out the allegiances that would prove decisive on the battlefield. These efforts weren't only about logistics. Margaret was shaping the perception of Henry himself. She was helping craft his image as not just a Lancastrian heir, but as a potential unifier, a monarch who could end decades of strife by bridging the rival houses of Lancaster and York through his proposed marriage to Elizabeth of York. This symbolism, this promise of reconciliation, was one of Margaret's most enduring contributions to Henry's claim. The betrothal between Henry and Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, was politically revolutionary. It offered the country something neither the Yorkists nor Lancastrians had previously been able to provide: an end to the war through dynastic unity. It was not merely a personal union, it was a symbolic one. With Margaret's careful cultivation of this narrative, support for Henry began to expand beyond his traditional Lancastrian base. When Henry finally landed on the coast of Wales in August 1485 with an army composed of exiles, mercenaries, and supporters from France and Brittany, he did so not just as a rebel, but as a contender with a legitimate and appealing claim. Margaret, still in England and closely monitored, maintained her composure, outwardly quiet but inwardly hopeful. She had prepared for this moment all her life. Her years of patience, sacrifice, and subtle maneuvering had brought Henry this far. But everything now hinged on the outcome of a single battle. The Battle of Bosworth on August 22, 1485, was brief but decisive. Richard III, leading a larger force, nonetheless found himself isolated as key nobles, including the Stanleys, withheld their troops until the outcome became clear. At a critical moment, Stanley's forces sided with Henry, helping to turn the tide. Richard, refusing to flee, was slain on the battlefield, the last English king to die in combat. The crown, famously retrieved from a thorn bush, was placed upon Henry's head, and with that, the Tudor dynasty was born. For Margaret, the moment was not just triumphal, it was transcendent. Her son had ascended to the throne, not merely as a victor of battle, but as the founding monarch of a new age. Henry VII's coronation on October 30, 1485, signaled a shift in English history. The civil wars were over. The Tudor dynasty, with its new emblem, the Tudor rose, a blend of the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, offered a powerful visual representation of unity. It was Margaret's vision made real, a dynastic synthesis that she had helped imagine and promote long before it seemed possible. Henry's first official act as king was a calculated one. He backdated his reign to the day before the Battle of Bosworth, thereby branding Richard's supporters as traitors. Yet he did not descend into vengeance. He chose to rule with caution and to consolidate power peacefully. In January 1486, the long-promised marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York took place, fulfilling the prophecy of peace and harmony. Their union symbolized the end of the Wars of the Roses and the dawn of a new chapter in English governance. In this new court, Margaret Beaufort's role was extraordinary. She had not only survived the brutal decades of civil conflict, she had emerged as the most influential woman in the kingdom. But Margaret was not content with a purely ceremonial role. She had always been active in her son's cause, and now she would be active in his reign. She styled herself My Lady the King's Mother, a title which she ensured was legally and ceremonially distinct from that of the Queen. She insisted on precedence over all other women in court, even the Queen Consort, her daughter-in-law. Henry acquiesced to nearly all of her requests. This wasn't just an act of filial devotion, it was recognition of her political intelligence and experience. Margaret had earned her place at the heart of the court, not through birth alone, but through decades of service to the crown she had helped establish. Margaret involved herself in governance, charitable patronage, and religious reform. She influenced appointments, shaped policies behind the scenes, and was even given her own royal household. Her presence was constant and often decisive. But she never overstepped her bounds. She remained, as always, politically astute. She advised, she guided, and she supported, never appearing to dominate or usurp authority. Her approach was that of a stateswoman, a maternal advisor whose loyalty to her son was absolute, but whose influence was deeply rooted in realpolitik. One of the most powerful legacies of Margaret's influence in this period was the emphasis on education and moral reform. A deeply pious woman, Margaret used her new status to patronize religious institutions, establish colleges, most notably at Cambridge, and sponsor the publication of devotional texts. Her vision of monarchy included not only political unity but also spiritual guidance, a monarch supported by divine favor and moral righteousness. The symbolism of the Tudor rose continued to resonate in all aspects of the new regime. It was printed on coins, carved into architecture, stitched into royal garments. It wasn't merely a floral design, it was an idea, a promise of stability. And that promise had been carefully curated by Margaret long before Bosworth. She understood the power of symbols, of narrative. The Tudor rose was a brand, one that told a story of healing and national rebirth. And indeed, for a time, England entered a period of relative peace. Henry VII's reign was marked by financial prudence, administrative reform, and careful diplomacy. While it would take years to fully secure the Tudor hold on the throne, challenges from Yorkist pretenders and foreign intrigue would continue. The foundations laid by Margaret were strong. She had prepared Henry not just to win, but to rule. When Henry and Elizabeth's first son, Arthur, was born in 1486, the future of the dynasty seemed assured. Margaret, now a grandmother, could see the continuation of her life's work in this new generation. Every moment of pain, exile, and sacrifice had been in service to this goal. Not merely to make her son king, but to establish a line of kings who would endure. The legacy of Margaret Beaufort's role in Henry's rise is not just measured in political victories. It is measured in the reshaping of England's monarchy, the transformation of female political agency, and the emergence of a new royal identity rooted in compromise, unity, and cautious strength. Her intellect, faith, and perseverance turned the tide of English history not with armies, but with alliances and ideals. As the Tudor era dawned, it was not just the end of civil war. It was the beginning of a new age, one made possible by a woman whose influence ran deeper than titles and bloodlines, and whose name would forever be entwined with the fate of a nation. In the years following the crowning of Henry VII, Margaret Beaufort emerged not as a relic of the dynastic struggle that had birthed the Tudor reign, but as a commanding and intelligent force who stood beside the throne, though never upon it. Her son may have worn the crown, but Margaret's presence was always felt in the corridors of power. She had earned that presence not through entitlement alone, but through relentless political foresight, shrewd maneuvering, and a steady belief in the divine justice of her son's claim. While most mothers of kings receded into the background or found themselves cloistered in obscurity, Margaret chose another path. She carved a space for herself that was without precedent in English royal history. Neither queen nor consort, but something unique and singularly powerful: My Lady the King's Mother. The very title she adopted speaks volumes. My Lady the King's Mother was not merely an honorific, it was a declaration of proximity, both familial and political, to the throne. With her characteristic precision, Margaret ensured that this title was officially recognized and recorded in court documents. She insisted on precedence over every woman in England, including Queen Elizabeth of York, her daughter-in-law. In a court obsessed with hierarchy, rank, and ceremonial nuance, this was a significant and potentially contentious position. But it was a reflection of her deep-rooted influence and the unspoken recognition of the role she had played in the establishment of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret's influence was not just symbolic. She wielded substantial sway over the policies of Henry's court. She had a voice, discreet, measured, but undeniable, in matters of governance, law, and diplomacy. Her apartments at court were strategically located near the king's, and her household was staffed with capable administrators who handled her correspondence and managed her extensive estates. Unlike many women of the time, Margaret maintained financial independence. She managed her properties, dispensed patronage, and corresponded with nobles and clerics alike, often serving as an intermediary for those who wished to petition the king. Her influence over court etiquette was equally pronounced. She shaped the tone and moral tenor of the Tudor court, which became known for its sobriety, restraint, and formality. A devout woman with a deep personal piety, Margaret infused the court with a religious seriousness that was reflective of her own values. She attended Mass regularly, supported the foundation of religious institutions, and read extensively from devotional texts. But her religiosity never came at the expense of political realism. She understood the necessity of display and ceremony in maintaining royal authority. Under her subtle guidance, the court struck a careful balance between ostentation and modesty, a mirror of Henry VII's own cautious approach to kingship. Margaret's involvement in diplomatic matters, though often understated, was influential. She was in frequent contact with leading clerics and foreign dignitaries, especially those from Spain and the Low Countries, and used her networks to smooth negotiations. She had a particular interest in matrimonial alliances, seeing them as critical tools for strengthening the Tudor dynasty. It's likely that she played a behind-the-scenes role in arranging the betrothal of her grandson, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, a union that promised to bind England to the powerful Spanish crown. While official negotiations were conducted by male diplomats, Margaret's counsel was sought and valued by Henry, whose respect for his mother was evident in the deference he showed her in matters both public and private. Yet her life at court was not without complexity. Her relationship with Elizabeth of York, wife of Henry VII, was one of subtle tensions and calculated harmony. On the surface, the two women represented the very unity the Tudor dynasty claimed to embody. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, reconciled through marriage. And indeed, their mutual commitment to the dynasty meant that public discord between them was carefully avoided. But beneath this polished surface, there were undoubtedly moments of friction. Margaret's insistence on taking precedence over Elizabeth in court ceremonies would have rankled the Queen and her allies. While Elizabeth was technically queen consort, her role was often overshadowed by the older, more politically adept Margaret. Elizabeth of York, by all accounts, was gentle, elegant, and gracious, qualities that made her a beloved queen, but not a particularly assertive one. She played her part well, producing heirs and maintaining the illusion of domestic harmony. But she did not possess the same intellectual fire or political experience as Margaret, whose decades of survival during England's most turbulent wars had sharpened her instincts and hardened her will. Margaret was not content with embroidery and idle talk. She had been a player in the Game of Thrones long before her son wore the crown, and she saw no reason to retire now. However, Margaret was also careful. She never undermined Elizabeth in public. Her power was exercised subtly, through influence rather than authority. She walked a fine line between queenly presence and maternal support, always mindful of appearances. Her chambers at court were opulent, but not excessive. Her correspondence was dignified, her behavior irreproachable. If she ever clashed with Elizabeth, it was behind closed doors, never in front of the court. Both women understood the stakes of their situation and prioritized the dynasty above personal feelings. Margaret's living arrangements further reflected her elevated but distinct role. At court, she maintained a separate household, complete with its own staff and ceremonies. She often resided in palatial settings, Colley Weston, Greenwich, or Westminster, where she received guests, held councils, and administered her estates. Her homes became centers of cultural and religious life. She supported scholars, sponsored the printing of religious works, and endowed colleges at Cambridge University. Her sponsorship of Christ's College and later St. John's College not only revealed her commitment to education and the Church, but also ensured that her name would be associated with intellectual refinement and moral instruction long after her death. In these domains, Margaret embodied the ideal of the Renaissance matron: learned, devout, dignified, and influential. She translated religious texts, participated in theological discussions, and maintained an impressive personal library. Her interest in education extended to women as well. She believed in moral instruction and the intellectual capability of her sex, even if she lived within the limits of her time. She was not a revolutionary, but she was certainly exceptional. The respect she commanded at court extended beyond the royal family. Nobles, bishops, and diplomats all understood that Margaret Beaufort was a woman to be consulted and heeded. She was known for her intelligence but also for her discretion. She did not seek public confrontation, and she avoided scandal with surgical precision. She had survived the Wars of the Roses not by brute force, but by adapting, by forging alliances, by thinking 2 moves ahead. That same cautious brilliance defined her years in Henry VII's court. Her relationship with Henry remained remarkably close. Even as king, he relied heavily on her advice. She was one of the few people he trusted implicitly. Their bond was forged in adversity, through exile, rebellion, and war. Now, in peacetime, that bond translated into a unique working partnership. Henry was a cautious, often anxious ruler, wary of enemies both real and imagined. In Margaret, he found not only a loving mother but a calm and steady advisor. She soothed his worries, helped him weigh decisions, and offered counsel that few others could. Even when Henry's health began to decline toward the end of his reign, Margaret remained by his side. She helped manage the transition of power, ensuring that her grandson, the future Henry VIII, would inherit a stable throne. She oversaw preparations for Arthur's marriage, and after Arthur's untimely death, she turned her attention to the next generation of Tudors. Her role in the political education of Henry VIII was limited, but her influence was deeply embedded in the values and traditions of the court he would inherit. When Henry VII died in 1509, Margaret was 66 years old, a remarkable age in a time when few women lived past 50. She had outlived most of her contemporaries and had seen her life's ambition realized. Yet even in her final months, she remained politically active. She organized her grandson's coronation and ensured the smooth succession of power. Only after this final task was complete did she allow herself to rest. She died shortly after the coronation of Henry VIII, her last political mission accomplished. Her death was mourned throughout the kingdom. Eulogies praised her piety, her wisdom, and her unwavering devotion to the Tudor cause. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey, designed by the renowned artist Pietro Torrigiano, reflected her stature: serene, noble, and richly adorned with symbols of her faith and family. Her legacy endured not only in the bloodline she had preserved and strengthened, but also in the institutions she had founded and the cultural ethos she had shaped. Margaret Beaufort's life at the court of Henry VII was unlike that of any other woman in English history. She was not queen, but she commanded the reverence of one. She did not reign, but she helped to rule. Her power was not conferred by crown or scepter, but by intellect, strategy, and maternal determination. In a world where women were expected to be silent and obedient, she had been bold and deliberate. And in doing so, she had transformed herself from a young widow to the matriarch of England's most iconic dynasty. Lady Margaret Beaufort, the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, was a woman of extraordinary depth and multifaceted strength, whose story was not solely defined by political ambition or dynastic success. Her life was equally rooted in profound religious devotion and an unwavering commitment to education, charity, and cultural patronage. Her legacy is not just one of maternal triumph and political calculation, but also of spiritual leadership, scholarly encouragement, and the quiet yet relentless assertion of female authority in a world dominated by men. Across the religious and intellectual landscape of England, Margaret's influence was etched in stone. In churches, colleges, and the hearts of those she inspired and supported. To understand the full breadth of her contribution, one must examine the balance she struck between piety and power, her groundbreaking patronage of education, and her defiance of the social limitations placed on women in the late medieval world. Margaret's deep religious convictions formed the moral and psychological bedrock of her life. In a time when faith permeated every aspect of society, hers was a spirituality not of passive ritual but of active devotion. Her daily practices were guided by intense personal discipline. She rose early for Mass, fasted regularly, and punctuated her day with prayers and readings from devotional texts. Her chaplains and confessors recorded a life marked by fervent belief in divine providence and penance. Yet Margaret's religiosity was not cloistered or insular. It extended outward into public action. Her spiritual life inspired her to engage with the world, to shape it for the better through education, patronage, and reform. The most visible and enduring symbols of her piety and patronage were the colleges she founded at Cambridge University, Christ's College and St. John's College. These institutions were not merely acts of charity or legacy building. They were founded with purpose, to cultivate a new generation of educated clergy and to strengthen the moral and intellectual fabric of the English Church. Christ's College, which she refounded in 1505, was granted a royal charter under her auspices. She invested not just money but vision into its curriculum, ensuring that it would uphold both classical learning and theological training. Later, she would endow St. John's College, which opened posthumously in 1511, using her extensive resources and legal acumen to circumvent challenges and ensure its permanence. These foundations were expressions of a deeper belief that knowledge and faith must be intertwined. She understood that a well-educated clergy could serve not only as spiritual leaders, but also as moral guides in a realm still healing from civil war. Her patronage also extended to the production and dissemination of religious texts. She was instrumental in the printing of several devotional books, including The Imitation of Christ, which she had translated into English. Through these efforts, she participated in the early English printing revolution, making spiritual and educational materials more accessible to the literate classes. Margaret's intellectual interests went beyond theology. She supported scholars, poets, and humanists, many of whom found in her court a safe haven for their ideas and writings. Her household became a small yet vibrant center of learning and conversation. She surrounded herself with theologians and teachers, such as John Fisher, who would later become Bishop of Rochester and a key figure in early English humanism. Her patronage helped to elevate the role of the university in national life, and to foster a climate of learning that would influence English society well into the Reformation and beyond. Her influence in religious reform, though more conservative than revolutionary, was significant. She did not advocate for sweeping ecclesiastical changes as would occur later in the century, but she did support greater clerical education, moral discipline, and charitable works. Her endowments often came with stipulations aimed at promoting ethical conduct among priests and scholars. In doing so, she anticipated some of the critiques of church corruption that would soon become widespread. Her faith was personal and institutional, and her vision for the church was one rooted in integrity, service, and scholarship. Beyond the realm of faith and learning, Margaret Beaufort's life was a sustained challenge to the gender norms of her time. The 15th century was not kind to ambitious women. Legal structures, cultural customs, and religious doctrine all reinforced the belief that women were intellectually and morally inferior to men. They were barred from formal political roles, could not hold public office, and were expected to be obedient to their fathers or husbands. Yet Margaret managed not only to navigate these constraints but to subvert them, skillfully and often silently. Legally, she was a marvel. Women at the time could not own land independently once married, yet Margaret ensured that she retained control of her estates through a series of legal maneuvers and royal grants. After her final marriage to Thomas Stanley, she secured the right to act as a femme sole, meaning she could administer her own property and conduct legal affairs in her own name, a rare privilege granted by her son. This autonomy was a testament to both her legal knowledge and the trust that Henry VII placed in her. She wielded the financial power of a great lord, managing estates, distributing patronage, and endowing institutions, all without the mediation of a male guardian. Her political agency was even more impressive. During her son's exile, she had moved like a shadow across England's political chessboard, quietly arranging alliances, forging loyalties, and risking everything to promote her son's claim to the throne. After Bosworth, her public role became more visible, but no less strategic. She was one of the few women to sit alongside the king at council meetings, to influence royal decisions, and to shape the course of Tudor policy. Her title, My Lady the King's Mother, was not ceremonial. It was the crown's acknowledgement that she was a pillar of the new regime. Margaret's ability to command this level of authority placed her among the most powerful women of her age, alongside figures like Elizabeth Woodville and Cecily Neville. Elizabeth, the Queen of Edward IV and mother of Elizabeth of York, had her own court and exercised influence through her beauty and familial connections. Cecily Neville, mother of Edward IV and Richard III, was a formidable matriarch with deep Yorkist roots. Yet Margaret differed in one critical respect. She was not queen or queen mother in the conventional sense. Her power came not from the crown, but from her intelligence, resilience, and relentless pursuit of her son's legitimacy. She carved her own space in the political hierarchy, a position no other woman had previously held. Her self-presentation was carefully calculated to reflect both her modesty and her authority. She often dressed in widow's black, signaling piety and humility, but she also used symbols of power, coats of arms, seals, and public ceremonies to assert her status. She took precedence over all women at court, including the queen, and her household mirrored that of royalty in structure and size. She moved through court and countryside not as a noblewoman seeking favor, but as a sovereign mother ensuring the continuation of her lineage and legacy. The lands she held were vast, spread across dozens of counties, and her control of them gave her not only wealth but influence. Landowners in late medieval England were political players by default, and Margaret's estates made her one of the most powerful magnates in the kingdom. But she was not merely a landholder, she was a steward, a benefactor, and a patron. She used her wealth to elevate deserving clerics, sponsor poor students, and endow religious institutions. Her benefactions were strategic and spiritual, aimed at building a legacy that would endure beyond dynastic fortune. Her ability to exist within, and yet beyond the traditional roles prescribed for women, set her apart from her contemporaries. Where others relied on their husbands or sons for influence, Margaret created her own power base. She embraced aspects of traditional womanhood, motherhood, piety, domestic management, but she imbued them with new meaning, turning them into instruments of political leverage and moral leadership. She lived in a male-dominated world, but she was never subordinate to it. In many ways, Margaret Beaufort prefigured later queens and female rulers who would take the reins of power more openly. She laid the foundation for female agency in the Tudor world, showing that a woman could be devout, dignified, and commanding all at once. Her legacy is not just visible in the red and white petals of the Tudor rose, or the chapels and colleges that bear her name. It lives in the notion that power can wear many faces, and that the quiet strength of a mother can reshape the destiny of a nation. When modern historians reflect on Margaret Beaufort's life, they are struck not only by what she achieved, but by how she achieved it. She operated in the shadows behind the throne, beside the altars, and within the walls of libraries and schools. Her life was a seamless blend of public and private influence, of devout service and political ambition. In the final analysis, she was not merely the mother of a king. She was the architect of a dynasty, the patron of a generation, and the embodiment of a new vision of feminine power, rooted in faith, sharpened by intellect, and carried with unshakable grace. Lady Margaret Beaufort's final decades were defined not by rest, but by continuity of vision, strategically guiding the Tudor dynasty she had helped birth, nurturing the court of her grandson Henry VIII, and securing the structures that would sustain her family's reign long after her passing. As Henry VII's most trusted advisor, she had played a defining role in creating the policies and alliances that stabilized the realm after the Wars of the Roses. But her ambitions were never confined to her own son's reign. With an eye on the future, Margaret set to work ensuring the strength and permanence of the Tudor line through careful instruction, mentorship, estate management, and courtly influence. Her legacy was not simply to found a dynasty, it was to prepare the ground for its endurance. Now the most powerful woman in England, holding the title My Lady the King's Mother, Margaret assumed a near-royal status and unique authority in Henry VII's court. Her relationship with her grandson, the future Henry VIII, was deeply influential, particularly in the years after the death of his mother, Elizabeth of York. Margaret took a special interest in his upbringing and education, ensuring that he was surrounded by skilled tutors, grounded in religious discipline, and trained in the political expectations of kingship. Though Henry's reign would eventually take a different character from that of his father and grandmother, it was Margaret's guiding hand that introduced him to the humanist learning, court etiquette, and statecraft that marked the early years of his rule. Her influence also extended to matters of succession and dynastic security. In a time when legitimacy and bloodline were constantly scrutinized, Margaret ensured that the Tudor claim would be solidified through carefully arranged marriages. She was heavily involved in the planning of the 1501 marriage between her grandson Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess whose union symbolized an international alliance with one of Europe's most powerful Catholic kingdoms. This marriage was not simply political. It was the cornerstone of England's re-emergence as a stable and respectable realm in European affairs. When Arthur died prematurely, Margaret supported the controversial idea that Catherine should marry his younger brother, Henry, to preserve the alliance and maintain diplomatic continuity. Within England, Margaret was equally invested in securing Tudor's strength through intermarriage with the nobility. She encouraged matches that reconciled rival families, integrated Yorkist bloodlines into the royal circle, and rewarded loyalty to the crown. These alliances helped reduce the threat of rebellion and foster a sense of national unity following decades of factional conflict. Her efforts ensured that no one noble family could amass enough power to challenge the throne again. Parallel to her political vision, Margaret maintained one of the most well-managed and influential landholdings in the kingdom. Her estates span numerous counties, including large tracts in the Midlands and the south of England. Unlike many noble estates, which were subject to waste or mismanagement, hers were meticulously administered. She employed talented stewards and accountants who kept her properties profitable and productive. These resources were not only used for her personal comfort, but often contributed directly to the financial health of the crown. Margaret understood that wealth and power were inseparable, and that the security of the Tudor monarchy depended as much on coin as on crown. She frequently lent money to the king and invested in royal initiatives, such as military campaigns, court expenses, and diplomatic missions. But she also ensured her wealth supported her other values: religion, education, and public welfare. Her estates became sites of patronage, not only for priests and scholars, but also for young nobles and ladies-in-waiting whom she mentored with the same strategic acumen she had once used to safeguard her son's life. These young courtiers, raised under her watch, became loyal servants of the crown and essential players in the Tudor administration. Margaret's influence at court was palpable not only in her direct access to the king, but in her role as a moral compass and model of royal femininity. For younger noble women, she provided both guidance and opportunity. Through her patronage, they could rise in favor, secure advantageous marriages, and find places in the royal household. She trained them in decorum, discretion, and diplomacy, skills that were as valuable at court as swords on the battlefield. Her ability to shape generations of courtiers extended her legacy beyond bloodline and into the cultural identity of the Tudor court itself. As Henry VII's health began to decline in the first decade of the 16th century, Margaret assumed even greater responsibilities. She helped ensure a smooth succession by organizing the political transition from father to son. When the king died in April 1509, it was Margaret who took control of court operations, funeral arrangements, and the legal transfer of authority. She worked closely with royal counselors to orchestrate her grandson Henry VIII's ascension to the throne, minimizing internal disruption and reaffirming the Tudor claim before dissent could arise. Despite her own failing health, she continued to serve as the kingdom's silent stabilizer, acting with a sense of duty that had defined her entire life. Her death came just 2 months after Henry VII's in June 1509. She lived long enough to see her grandson crowned and her life's mission fulfilled, but the toll of a lifetime spent in near-constant service had left her body weak. She died peacefully at Westminster, surrounded by members of her household and clergy, who mourned not only a great lady, but a spiritual guide and benefactor. Her passing was marked by public mourning across England. The court wore black, prayers were said in every major cathedral, and tributes poured in from clergy, scholars, and nobility alike. Margaret was buried in Westminster Abbey, one of the few women not of royal blood to be honored with a tomb there. Her final resting place lies beside the altar, beneath a magnificent tomb designed by the Florentine sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, the same artist who created Henry VII's effigy. The tomb, with its vivid effigy of Margaret in prayer, remains one of the most striking monuments in the abbey. She is depicted not as a queen or noble woman, but as a devout Christian, hands folded, eyes closed, dressed in the austere garb she had worn in life. The Latin inscription surrounding her tomb does not extol political victories or dynastic triumphs, but rather praises her virtue, wisdom, and unwavering faith. The symbolism was deliberate. Even in death, Margaret was crafting her legacy, not in the image of martial conquest or regal splendor, but as a servant of God and guardian of England. Yet her influence in the living world did not end with her burial. Almost immediately, her life began to be mythologized by the Tudor court. In an age where legitimacy was as much a story as a fact, Margaret became part of the official narrative of Tudor ascendancy. She was featured in sermons, poems, and chronicles as the divinely inspired mother of a dynasty, a woman whose virtue had cleansed England of civil war and ushered in an age of peace and prosperity. The early Tudor propaganda machine embraced her image as both a maternal figure and a moral exemplar. Her name was invoked in court ceremonies, university speeches, and religious dedications. She was remembered not only as Henry VII's mother, but as the spiritual grandmother of the Tudor age, an almost saint-like figure who had walked the corridors of power with humility, discretion, and divine favor. Her colleges continued to bear her name and her memory, producing generations of clergy, scholars, and statesmen who honored her vision. Her books, translations, and charitable foundations remained active influences on English religious life for decades. In truth, Margaret Beaufort's legacy cannot be confined to a single role. She was a mother, a matriarch, a landowner, a courtier, a patron, and a stateswoman. But more than any of these, she was a force of continuity, between old dynasties and new ones, between war and peace, between piety and politics. Her life spanned one of England's most volatile periods, and she emerged not only unbroken, but triumphant. What makes her story extraordinary is not merely that she survived, but that she shaped history from the margins. In an era when women were excluded from formal power, she created her own authority. In a court dominated by men, she dictated policy and nurtured generations of leaders. And in a time of violence and instability, she provided the moral and strategic leadership that made the Tudor dynasty possible. Today, Margaret Beaufort is rightly remembered not just as the mother of Henry VII, but as the mother of the Tudor world, a woman who, without wearing a crown, ruled with wisdom, foresight, and a legacy that endures in the very institutions she built. Her life was not an accident of birth, but a testament to purpose, a deliberate shaping of history through faith, loyalty, and vision. Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII and grandmother of Henry VIII, has been remembered through a complex and evolving historiography. Initially portrayed through Tudor propaganda and ecclesiastical records, her image has been reinterpreted over centuries, reflecting changing societal values and scholarly perspectives. Early depictions of Margaret were shaped by the Tudor regime's need to legitimize its rule. Chroniclers and church records emphasized her piety, wisdom, and maternal devotion, presenting her as the virtuous matriarch of the new dynasty. These portrayals highlighted her role in establishing educational institutions and her deep religious convictions, aligning her image with the moral and spiritual ideals of the time. In modern scholarship, historians have delved deeper into Margaret's political acumen and influence. Studies have examined her strategic marriages, estate management, and patronage of religious and educational institutions. This research has illuminated her active participation in the political sphere, challenging earlier narratives that confined her role to that of a passive supporter of her son's ambitions. Cultural representations of Margaret in literature, television, and film have varied widely. While some portrayals, such as in The White Queen, depict her as a devout and determined figure, others have cast her in a more negative light, emphasizing ambition and manipulation. These interpretations often reflect contemporary attitudes toward powerful women and the complexities of female agency in historical narratives. Feminist reinterpretations have further reshaped our understanding of Margaret Beaufort. Scholars have highlighted her navigation of the male-dominated political landscape, her assertive use of power, and her contributions to women's education and religious life. By examining her life through a feminist lens, historians have recognized her as a formidable figure who wielded significant influence in a patriarchal society. Margaret Beaufort's legacy is multifaceted, encompassing her roles as a mother, political strategist, patron, and religious devotee. The dynasty she helped establish endured for over a century, and her vision and resilience in a volatile world have solidified her place as a central architect of Tudor England. Her evolving historiography reflects broader shifts in historical inquiry and cultural values, ensuring that her contributions continue to be examined and appreciated in new and meaningful ways.